Welcome back to my channel, and if you are visiting for the first time, you are also highly welcome. In this channel, we simplify anatomy, and here we also learn anatomy with so much fun. Let's look at the anatomy of the right atrium. The right atrium is the right upper chamber of the heart. This is the entire configuration of the heart. And we know that the heart is divided into the upper chamber and the lower chamber. And this is where the demarcation is. The upper chamber of the heart is made up of two atria, which are the right and the left atria, while the lower chamber is made up of two ventricles, which are the right and the left ventricle. For the upper chamber of the heart, the right upper part is where we have the right atrium. Just as the name implies, this region is the first region that receives deoxygenated blood. So the first region of the heart where deoxygenated blood is pumped into is the right atrium. And it receives deoxygenated blood from the largest vein in the body, which are the superior and the inferior vena cava. This is the superior vena cava, and down here we have the inferior vena cava. From the superior vena cava, deoxygenated blood from the upper regions is drained into the superior vena cava, while deoxygenated blood from the lower region of the body is drained into the inferior vena cava. So the right atrium is the first region where deoxygenated blood is pumped into. From this region, it is then further pushed down into the right ventricle, and this is the right ventricle. And from the right ventricle, the deoxygenated blood is then taken up through the pulmonary artery, and this is the pulmonary artery, which carries deoxygenated blood to the lungs where it will be oxygenated. We know that arteries generally carry oxygenated blood except for the pulmonary artery, and this is where that is presented. So the pulmonary artery then carries the deoxygenated blood to the lungs where it will be oxygenated, and this is the lungs highlighted in blue, and it takes deoxygenated blood into it to receive oxygen. From the lungs, the blood that is now oxygenated will then be transferred back into the heart through the pulmonary vein, and this is the pulmonary vein. We also know that veins carry deoxygenated blood except for the pulmonary vein that carries oxygenated blood. This is also where that is established. So we have the blood that is now oxygenated carried by the pulmonary vein into the heart, and the region of the heart where this is released into is the left atrium. It goes into the left atrium. From the left atrium, this is then further pushed down into the left ventricle. So from the left ventricle, the blood that is oxygenated, that is ready to feed the different organs of the body with oxygen and nutrients, will then be pushed through the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. And this is the part the blood runs through. So the aorta then delivers the blood that is oxygenated to the different organs in the body with oxygen and nutrients. And that is the way it goes. So the first region of the heart where deoxygenated blood is first delivered into is the right atrium, before it is now further pushed to the lungs where it will be oxygenated and also taken back into the heart before it now supplies the different organs in the body with oxygen and nutrients. So having established that the right atrium received deoxygenated blood from the superior and the inferior vena cava, these are not the two channels through which deoxygenated blood is emptied into the right atrium. We also have other channels through which deoxygenated blood is also released. So let's try and unfold these. So we try and divide venous drainage into the right atrium into the major venous drainage and also the minor venous drainage. For the major venous drainage into the right atrium, we have the superior and the inferior vena cava, and this is the superior vena cava, which we already established that receives venous blood from the upper regions of the body. Then the inferior vena cava, which also receives venous blood from the lower region of the body. These two deliver deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. This is a major venous drainage. For the minor venous drainage, we have venous blood that drains the heart tissue. We know that the heart is responsible for pumping out blood. It also needs to feed its own cell with blood for it to undergo its metabolic activity so as to exhibit the pumping action. So they need their own blood supply, even if it is responsible for pumping blood. So from its own arterial supply, it also has its own venous drainage. So deoxygenated blood that is drained from the heart tissue is also released into the right atrium, and one of those drainage is the coronary sinus. This is the coronary sinus that its orifice opens into the right atrium. We also have the anterior cardiac vein, the vena cordis minimi, which are smallest cardiac vein, and also referred to as the Sebacean veins. These veins are small veins that drain the four chambers of the heart. They also release deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Then we have the right marginal vein. So you can see that apart from the superior and the inferior vena cava, we also have drainage that comes from the heart tissue that also drains blood into the right atrium. So let's look at the external features of the right atrium. If you look at the right atrium on the outside, there are some features or characteristics that are seen to be exhibited by the right atrium. It forms the right border of the heart, and this is the right border of the heart. Remember my lecture on the heart. If you've not checked that lecture, please kindly go and do so for you to get updated. We said that the right border of the heart is formed by the right atrium, and this is the right atrium, and that is what falls into the right border of the heart. So it forms the right border of the heart. It is also separated from the right ventricle by the atrioventricular groove. This is the atrioventricular groove here. This is the groove that is seen between the atrium and the ventricle. And this is the right atrioventricular groove, because we have the left atrioventricular groove that separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. But on the right side is where we are concentrating on. So this is the right atrioventricular groove that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. It is seen to allow the passage of the right coronary artery and also small cardiac vein. So if you look deep into this depression or groove that is termed the right atrioventricular groove, you have vessels passing along it. And these had the right coronary artery and also the small cardiac vein. There's also another groove that separates the right atrium from the left atrium. This is the right atrium here, and this is where we have the left atrium. Between the two atria, you also have a space that is created between them. This space also allows for the passage of two vessels, and the first one is the main pulmonary artery. Remember a pulmonary artery that we say carries deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle. From the right ventricle is where deoxygenated blood is pushed into the pulmonary artery for it to supply the lungs where it will be oxygenated. So between the two atria, we have this groove, and within this groove is where we have the passage of the pulmonary artery. So the interatrial groove allows for the passage of the pulmonary artery that is going to supply deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Also, we have the ascending aorta. From the left ventricle, the blood that is now oxygenated, that is ready to be transported to the different structures in the body or organs in the body, we pass through the ascending aorta, which is the initial segment of the aorta. You also have that within the space that is created between the two atria. Also to add that we have the auricles. The auricles at times is mistaken for the atrium. The auricle is an hair-shaped pouch that is seen at the external surface of the atrium, and this is called the auricle. So this is the auricle, harrowed in green. This out pouch that is called the auricle will increase the volume of the right atrium because more space will be created for deoxygenated blood to be emptied into. So going further on the external features, it's also good for us to establish the sulcus terminalis. The sulcus terminalis is a shallow depression that is created between the sinus venarum and also the right atrium proper. Let's try and dive into this to see what this means. This is the configuration of the right atrium. The sinus venarum is the space where the superior and the inferior vena cava open into. So this is the sinus venarum here. This space, between this space and the right atrium proper, the right atrium proper is seen in the anterior part of the right atrium. So there is a depression that is created on the external surface. So you have a depression out here, just around this region, where it separates the sinus venarum at the back and also the right atrium proper at the front. The right atrium proper here is chopped off, so it's opened so that the interiors of the right atrium can be seen. But if we imagine that the right atrium proper is seen, that means it's going to be a muscular ridge that is seen to cover this open space. So there is going to be a depression that is created along this region on the outside. And this depression is what is called sulcus terminalis. This has a very important landmark, but it is good for us to understand the basis behind this depression. And if you look at this image down here, the right atrium is also opened. This is the right atrium proper. This is like a muscular ridge that is created in the anterior part of the right atrium. It's because this is opened up. So if you try to flip this back to cover this opening, you are going to see behind it the depression that is created, that is called the sulcus terminalis, that tends to be seen or bordered between the sinus venerum and also the right atrium proper, which is this muscular presentation here. So this depression is what is called sulcus terminalis. Let's try and also use this image to further expatiate on what the sulcus terminalis means. This is the configuration of the right atrium. On the other side, we have the left atrium, and inferiorly, we have the ventricles. This is the right ventricle, and this is the left ventricle. Around this region, we have the posterior region where the superior and the inferior vena cava will open into. This is the superior vena cava and this is the inferior vena cava. The space between the superior and the inferior vena cava is where we have the sinus venarum. So this is the sinus venarum. So if you come more anteriorly is when you now see the right atrium proper, which is made up of pectinate muscle, which are parallel muscular ridges. And this is what is presented in this image. So let's say this is now translated to being in this space. So between this right atrium proper and also the sinus venarum, you now have a demarcation or a depression that is called the sulcus terminalis. So this depression is so created between these two regions of the right atrium. So if you try to divide the right atrium on the outside into two, we have the sinus venarum and you have the right atrium proper. So between these two is where we have the sulcus terminalis. So the space between the superior and inferior vena cava, the sinus venarum, this is the sinus venarum, and between this space and also the right atrium proper, which is located in this region, is where we have the sulcus terminalis. Also, to drive in the sulcus terminalis, because we say is a depression. For a depression to occur on the external surface, it means it's going to create a ridge on the inside because of the depression on the outside. So the ridge that is created on the inside, or the bulge that is created as a result of the depression created on the outside, is called the crystal terminalis. You can see from the name the relationship between the sulcus terminalis and the crystal terminalis. It's good for us to really understand this. If you look at it on the outside, you see there is a depression, and that is called the sulcus terminalis using this diagram here. Because of this depression, it's now going to create a ridge or a bulge on the inside, which is now called the crystal terminalis. These two structures have critical landmarks in the right atrium. So that will take us to the interior of the right atrium. For the interior of the right atrium, we have some specific features that we would be highlighting. But before we dive into this, let's try and subdivide the interior into the sub-regions that it is made up of. The first region is the smooth posterior part. Then we have the rough anterior part, which is also the atrium proper. Then we have the interatrial septum. If you look at the names of the three sub-regions, you will be able to establish where they are placed. For the smooth posterior part, it means it is located posteriorly and it presents a smooth configuration. So this is made up of the sinus venarum. Remember when we try to establish the sulcus terminalis and the crystal terminalis, we say that the region between the superior and inferior vena cava is where we have the sinus venerum, and this is the region of the sinus venerum between the superior and inferior vena cava. This region is the smooth posterior region of the right atrium because it's located at the back. And if you look at the inner configuration or presentation, you see that it appears to be smooth. Then the second region is the rough anterior part. The rough anterior part is made up of pectinate muscle, which are muscular ridges that look like the teeth of a comb. And this is the rough anterior part that is also referred to as the atrium proper. The right atrium in this image is opened up. If you try to flip this muscle back to cover this space, you see that it's going to be seen in the anterior part. And if you look at the inner configuration, you see that it appears to be rough. And this roughness is created as a result of the muscular ridges of pectinate muscle. So this is also referred to as the right atrium proper because this is where the bulk of the action of the right atrium is exhibited from because of the muscular presentation. Then we have the interatrial septum. From the name, the interatrial septum is the barricade that is created between the right and the left atria. So this is the interatrial septum. So if you drive into this space, the next compartment or chambers that you'll be seeing is the left atrium. So this interatrial septum separates the right atrium from the left atrium. So these are the three sub-regions of the right atrium. And we also try and drive into each of the sub-regions to see the specific features that they present. The smooth part allows for inflow of blood. We said that the sinus venerum is the smooth region of the right atrium. And if you look at this space that is created between the superior and inferior vena cava, you see that it is this region that receives deoxygenated blood from the superior and the inferior vena cava. While the function of the rough muscular part is to exhibit pumping action, and that is where the blood is then pushed into the right ventricle at this space. So you see that the different subregions, of course, present their own function. And in terms of the interatrial septum, is to demarcate the right atrium from the left atrium. Also to add, when we discuss about the sulcus terminalis and also the crista terminalis that is seen to create a form of depression on the outside and a ridge on the inside between the sinus venerum and also the right atrium proper, we can establish that the line of demarcation between the rough and the smooth part of the right atrium is the crista terminalis. And this should be understandable because we already established that the sinus venerum, so this is the smooth part of the right atrium, and this anterior region that appears to be rough is the right atrium proper. So the demarcation between the smooth and the rough part of the right atrium is formed by the crista terminalis on the inside, while on the outside it is demarcated by the sulcus terminalis. So this is the sinus venerum, which is the region of the smooth part of the right atrium. And this is the rough part, which is made up of the pectinate muscle and also referred to as the right atrium proper. And the demarcation between these two regions is the crista terminalis. The crista terminalis on the inside, while on the outside we have the sulcus terminalis. So let's look at the smooth posterior part. We also have a distinguishing feature around the smooth posterior part of the right atrium. We already established that the smooth posterior part of the right atrium is the sinus venerum, which is the space that is created between the superior and the inferior vena cava. At the upper part of this region is where we have the sinoarterial node. The sinoarterial node is a collection of specialized crescent-shaped cells which helps to initiate heartbeat. Remember, we said this is the first region where deoxygenated blood is emptied into, and this is the point where heartbeat is also initiated from. Because of the presence of the sinoarterial node, the SA node are pacemaker. They are pacemaker of the heart because it is this structure that sets the rhythm or heartbeat of the heart. SA node, which is the sinoarterial node, is located at the upper junction of the opening of the superior vena cava and also the crista terminalis. This is the crista terminalis and this is the superior vena cava. So the junction between these two structures is where the SA node is located. And also in this image down here, this is the sinus venerum, and around this space is where we have the crista terminalis. So between the junction of the crista terminalis and also the sinus venerum, towards the opening of the superior vena cava, this is the superior vena cava and this is the inferior vena cava. So towards the opening of the superior vena cava is where we have the location of the SA node. So this is also the sinoarterial node in this image. So why the sinoarterial node? Why that name tag? And also, why is it located in this region? If you try to break down the name sinoarterial node, it means sinus and atrium. And we already said that this is the sinus venerum, which is the space that is created between the superior and inferior vena cava. It's actually the smooth posterior region of the right atrium. So between this region and the crista terminalis, this is the crista terminalis. After the crista terminalis, the next structure that we see is the muscular part of the right atrium. So between the right atrium proper and also the sinus venerum is where we have the location of the sinoarterial node. And if you try to break down the name sinus and arterial, so that can be justified from the formation or the establishment of the name sinoarterial node. And that is why it is so named sinoarterial node. It is also located at this region because this is the first region where deoxygenated blood is emptied into the heart. And for that reason, the initiation of heartbeat will also occur in this region because of the arrival of deoxygenated blood that needs to be pumped through the different regions of the heart. Then let's look at the interatrial septum. The interatrial septum, we already said that is a septum that separates the right atrium from the left atrium. And this is the interatrial septum. In the interatrial septum, we have what we call the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis is a depression that is created in the interatrial septum. This fossa ovalis is an embryonic remnant of the foramen ovale. This is an aperture that is created between the right atrium and the left atrium so that blood can move from the right atrium to the left atrium during the development of life, before the development of the pulmonary circulation. This is just to bypass the pulmonary circulation because organs that are involved in it are yet to develop. So there's going to be the transportation of blood from the right atrium to the left atrium. So we have the fossa ovalis that is harrowed in green, which is a depression that is created in the interatrial septum. Another structure that we need to highlight is the triangle of Koch, or Koch triangle. This is a triangular region that is created on also the interatrial septum. And within this triangular space is where we have the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node connects the atria and the ventricles to coordinate heartbeats. So let's look at the borders of the triangle of Koch. In the front, we have the septal leaflet of the tricuspid valve. This is the tricuspid valve that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. So this septal leaflet of this valve is seen to border the triangle at the front, and this is what is arrowed in yellow. Also behind, we have the orifice of the coronary sinus. This is the coronary sinus here, and the orifice or the opening of this sinus into the right atrium is seen to bound this triangle behind. Then superiorly or above, we have the tendon of Todaro. This is the tendon of Todaro. In this region, highlighted in blue. So these three structures form the borders of the triangular space that is called the triangle of Koch. And within this triangle is where we have the atrioventricular node. So you see the atrioventricular node housed in this space. And we know that the atrioventricular node helps in the coordination of heartbeats. Let's check our understanding of this lecture. The first question is to explain the major and minor venous drainage into the right atrium. And the second question is to describe the features on the right interatrial septum. The third question is, what is the relationship between the sulcus terminalis and the crista terminalis? This should come easy. The last question is, what is Koch triangle and its relevance? Thanks for watching. Let's meet again.